Sadie Callahan wasn't the kind of girl who gave up on something just because everyone else already had. She wasn't loud about it either. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't try to convince anyone of anything. She just carried the runt of the litter out to the barn one October morning, set him down in a nest of old feed sacks, and decided, quietly, that he was hers to raise. If stories about second chances and the animals nobody else wanted move you, subscribe and join us every day, because there's a new one waiting right here tomorrow. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. The Callahan farm sat at the edge of Wexford County, Kentucky, where the ridgelines rolled soft and green into one another, and the fences had been mended so many times they were more wire than post. Sadie was 13, with a single blonde braid that fell down her back and a face full of freckles that had been earned honestly, one summer at a time, working alongside her grandfather. Walter Callahan was 68 years old, a widower with a trimmed gray beard and a straw hat that never seemed to leave his head, not even in the barn. His wife Eleanor had been gone 6 years now, but her handwriting still filled the pages of the farm ledger kept on the kitchen shelf. And Walter still talked about her the way a man talks about someone who's only stepped out for a minute. The farm ran sheep and a small dairy herd, and like every working farm in that part of Kentucky, it depended on dogs, not pets. Working dogs, border collies mostly, bred over generations for the particular genius of moving a flock with nothing but posture and eye contact, and the low, certain sound of a human voice giving commands from 50 yards off. A good sheepdog was worth more to a farm like the Callahans than almost any piece of equipment they owned. A bad one was worse than useless. A bad one could scatter a flock into a ditch or a road in about 4 seconds flat. The litter had come from Ruth Bellamy's kennel 2 farms over. 6 pups out of a proven working line, the kind of pedigree that usually sold before the pups even opened their eyes. Walter had put a deposit down on the pick of the litter back in August. But when the litter was 7 weeks old, Ruth called the house with an apology in her voice. One of the pups, she said, wasn't right. He didn't startle at loud noises. He didn't come when she clapped or whistled. A vet out of Danville had confirmed it a few days later. The pup was almost certainly born deaf, both ears, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Nobody wants a deaf dog, Dale Hargrove said, when word got around, the way word always does in a county that small. Dale was a heavy-set man who farmed the land just south of the Callahans, and he said it the way he said most things, loud and certain, standing at the fence line in his ball cap and plaid work shirt with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Can't work a dog that can't hear a command. That pup's not a sheepdog. That pup's a lawn ornament. His brother Roy, leaner, quieter, but no less certain, just nodded along, arms crossed over his chest. Ruth ought to put it down, honestly, Roy said, kinder than watching it fail at the one thing it was bred to do. Walter didn't say much back. He rarely did when people got to talking like that. But Sadie had been standing behind him at the feed store when the conversation happened. And something about the flatness in Roy's voice, the easy way he'd written off a living thing before it had even had a chance, settled into her like a stone dropped in still water. She rode her bike over to Ruth Bellamy's place that same afternoon. The pup was the smallest of the litter, a black and white bundle with one blue eye and one brown, curled alone in the corner of the whelping box, while his litter mates tumbled over each other, chasing a squeaky toy he couldn't hear rattle. He didn't turn his head at Sadie's footsteps. He only noticed her when her shadow crossed the light coming through the barn door, and then his whole body went still, watching her, waiting to understand what she was. He watches everything, Ruth said quietly. Watches like his life depends on it. Makes sense, I suppose. It kind of does. Sadie knelt down and held out her hand, palm up, the way you'd offer it to any dog. The pup sniffed it, then pressed his whole small head into her palm. And that was that. She carried him home in the front basket of her bike, wrapped in her flannel shirt, and named him Scout, because Walter said a dog that watched that closely for meaning deserved a name that meant the same thing. Dale and Roy weren't cruel about it, not exactly. They were the kind of neighbors who'd still help pull a truck out of a ditch at 2 a.m. But they made their opinion plain every time the subject came up at the feed store or after church. A deaf dog on a working sheep farm was, in their eyes, a soft-hearted mistake dressed up as kindness. Something a person did because it felt good, not because it made any sense. Sadie didn't argue with them. She didn't need to. She had a plan already forming, and it didn't require anyone's permission. She'd read, in one of her grandmother Eleanor's old farm journals, a passage about a deaf cattle dog a distant cousin had once owned back in the 1950s. Trained entirely on hand signals because the dog had lost its hearing to distemper as a puppy. Eleanor had written the whole method down in her small, careful handwriting, the way she'd written down everything worth remembering. Planting schedules, canning times, the exact temperature for scalding a hog. Sadie found the page one evening going through the ledger with Walter, and she read it twice, then a third time, before she looked up at her grandfather. "I want to try this," she said. "With Scout." Walter studied the page a long moment, his thumb resting against the corner where Eleanor's handwriting had faded soft with age. "Your grandmother built half this farm on things folks said couldn't be done," he said finally. "Go on then." The training started small. Sadie learned first that a deaf dog has to be taught to check in, to glance back at its handler constantly, the way a hearing dog might listen for a change in tone. She spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but rewarding Scout every time his eyes found hers. A small piece of dried liver from her pocket. A scratch behind the ears. Until the pup began offering that eye contact on his own, again and again, waiting to see what she wanted. From there, she built a vocabulary, one sign at a time. A flat palm pushed forward meant walk on, move toward the sheep. A closed fist raised meant stop, freeze exactly where you are. 2 fingers pointed left or right, sent him wide around a flock in either direction. A palm pressed low to the ground, fingers spread, meant lie down. And that one took the longest of all. 3 full weeks of patient repetition in the yard before Scout's belly finally dropped to the grass on command, eyes locked on Sadie's hand like it was the only thing in the world worth watching. She practiced every morning before school and every evening after chores, rain or shine, using a small flock of 6 ewes Walter kept separate in the near pasture just for training. There were failures, more than a few. In November, Scout misread a stop signal and sent 3 ewes crashing through a gap in the fence Walter had meant to mend for a month. And it took the better part of an hour and Walter's help to round them back up out of the Hargroves' cornfield. Dale watched the whole thing from his porch, arms crossed, and didn't say a word, which somehow felt louder than anything he could have said. "Maybe they're right," Sadie admitted to Walter that night, sitting on the porch steps with Scout's head heavy in her lap. "Maybe I'm just making it harder on him." Walter sat down beside her, the old boards creaking under his weight. "Your grandmother used to say a thing wasn't wrong just because it was hard," he said. "She said hard and wrong get confused by people looking for an excuse to quit early." He scratched Scout behind one ear, and the pup leaned into his hand without ever taking his eyes off Sadie's face. "This dog's watching you harder than any hearing dog I ever raised watched a whistle. That's not nothing, Sadie girl. That's a different kind of listening." She kept going. By January, Scout could hold 6 ewes in a loose circle from 40 feet away, reading nothing but the shape of Sadie's hands and the set of her shoulders. By March, he'd learned to widen his outrun on a single raised-arm signal, swinging in a smooth arc around the flock the way any pedigreed working dog was bred to do. And Walter started letting him work the larger flock in the back 40 on weekend mornings. Just the two of them and 40 head of sheep moving quiet and orderly across the wet spring grass. Then, in April, Sadie learned that her neighbor 2 farms down, an elderly widow named Nadine Ferris, had been struggling for months with her own aging sheepdog, a good old collie named Duke, who'd worked her flock faithfully for 11 years, but had gone almost completely deaf himself over the last winter, the way old dogs sometimes do. Nadine had a bad hip and couldn't walk fast enough to herd the sheep herself anymore. And Duke, once so sharp on her whistle commands, now stood in the pasture confused and anxious, unable to hear a single word she called. Nadine had been quietly making peace with the idea that she might have to sell off her small flock entirely. 22 ewes, some of them descended from stock her own late husband had raised. Gone because there was no dog left who could hear her. Sadie thought about that for 2 days before she worked up the nerve to ride her bike over and knock on Nadine's door. "I've got a dog who was trained his whole life without sound," Sadie told her, standing on the porch with Scout sitting calm and alert at her heel. "He doesn't need your voice at all. He just needs your hands. I could teach you the signs if you wanted. And Duke, too, maybe, if it's not too late for him." Nadine looked at the girl for a long moment, then down at the black and white dog watching her with one blue eye and one brown, patient as a held breath. It took most of May. Sadie rode over 3 afternoons a week, teaching Nadine the same vocabulary of signs she'd built with Scout: the flat palm, the raised fist, the 2 fingers splitting left and right. Old Duke picked up more of it than anyone expected, his years of working experience filling in gaps his failing years no longer could. And Scout worked alongside him in the pasture like the 2 of them had always been a team. One steady on instinct, the other steady on sight. By the middle of June, Nadine Ferris stood at her own fence line and, using nothing but her hands, sent Duke and Scout together in a wide, matched arc around all 22 ewes, gathering them smooth and unhurried into the pen beside her barn. She hadn't spoken a single word the entire time. She didn't need to. Her flock was safe, her old dog had a new season of purpose in him, and a 13-year-old girl 3 farms over had a written page in her grandmother's ledger to thank for showing her where to start. Word got around the county the way it always does. Dale Hargrove came by one evening in early July, driving slow up the gravel drive, and found Sadie in the near pasture running Scout through a full set of signals just for the pleasure of watching him work. Dale stood at the fence a while, not saying anything, arms uncrossed for once. "Never seen a dog work that clean off nothing but hand signs," he admitted finally. "Roy still thinks I'm making it up when I tell him." "He's not making anything up," Sadie said, and left it at that, because there wasn't really anything else that needed saying. That evening, after Dale had gone, Walter found Sadie in the barn, brushing the last of the pasture dust out of Scout's black and white coat, while the dog leaned his whole weight into her, eyes half closed, utterly content. Walter stood in the doorway a moment, remembering something his wife used to say about the animals other people gave up on too fast. The naturalist Aldo Leopold once wrote that there are 2 spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery store, and the other is the danger of supposing that heat comes from the furnace. Walter thought of that quote often, standing in barns at the end of long days. But what he told Sadie that night was simpler than any quote could be. "Your grandmother would have loved that dog," he said. "Not because he's clever, because you didn't quit on him when quitting would have been easy. He set a hand on Sadie's shoulder. That's the real harvest here, Sadie girl, not the dog working. You learning that some things just need a different kind of patience than the rest of the world is willing to give. Sadie didn't say much back. She just kept brushing, and Scout kept leaning into her hand, watching her the way he'd watched her since the very first afternoon in Ruth Bellamy's barn, waiting to understand and understanding in his own quiet way, more than anyone had ever expected him to. What lesson has an animal or a person nobody believed in ever taught you? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you'd like to go deeper into stories like Sadie and Scout's, we've put together an ebook full of them, waiting for you in the description below this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a new story from the Callahan farm and beyond waiting for you every single day. We'll see you tomorrow, right here, with another one.